Okay. All right, folks. We've had some electronic glitches this week, so we're a little behind, but we only have a few chapters left, so we're okay. We're good. So I'm just going to put these up, and we're going to go through the week, and we're going to get them done, and you'll work on your papers, and we will have gotten through all of the material, and then you guys can get to your summer and kind of crisis debrief on all of these things that have happened this year. I know it's been kind of crazy, and whatever summer classes you may be taking online. So breathe in, exhale, and just keep plugging along. You'll get there. You will get there. All right, chapter 12. Let's talk about the development of self and social understandings. Okay, so what are we talking here? So I've talked about it before. Some of this is now going to be a little bit of layering details onto foundations. These last few chapters are sort of details on top of the foundation. So the foundation is really understanding the biology, cognitive and how that works, and then development of intellect and all of those things, and then you have emotional development, and this is really sort of that broader spectrum of how all of those things come together to make a social child, and how do they understand themselves, and how do they understand themselves as a member of various groups. Okay, so as a member of the who they are in themselves, in a family, in a classroom, in a school, in a cohort, in an age group, peers, authority, all of those things, okay? So let's talk about what we mean when we say a sense of self. In their youngest years, we're talking about a sense of kids understanding that literally they are separate, that they are a separate being first physically as infants, and then they learn as they get to be 2 or 3 that they are separate people with separate emotional lives and psychological lives, and that takes until about 4 or 5 years old to really learn. And then we start getting into this idea about who I am. I am a girl. I am a boy. I am good at sports. I am not good at sports. I like science. I'm good at this. I'm good at that. Those kinds of things become the knowledge, beliefs, and judgments and feelings about yourself, because everything you think you're good at or bad at or you struggle with or it's a trouble creates lower self-esteem, and then the things that you feel good about, that you feel proud of, that people are proud of you for, that all comes back to this idea of I am a good self. So that's the important thing. See? How good am I as a person? And you learn how good you are as a person by how well other people treat you, right? So your parents, in an ideal world, teach you that you are something of value, that you are of value in their life, that you are of value to your teacher, that you are of value to, you are of value. And it's in the small ways. You know, the thing that comes to mind through all of this, I don't know if I've mentioned it in any context that you would remember. I'm actually a member of the Ohio Crisis Response Team, which is the disaster relief team of various professionals who go into things like this, the coronavirus, or something more geographical like a bombing, and do crisis debriefing. And so I have been serving on call as part of that team, and we've been rotating, and I sort of we're on call 24 hours a day for 7 straight days. So I'm just coming off of my on-call status. And, not for nothing, it's just sort of being available for anyone who might call into the hotline to be in crisis around all of this. And, was it a big deal? No, it wasn't that big a deal. Did it take a lot out of me? No, it didn't really necessarily in the end take a lot out of me, other than just having to remember that I needed to have my phone on me 24 hours a day. But in my email this morning was a personal thank you from the executive director of the national service that I'm part of, and just a certificate it was like a certificate of honor, or I don't know, something, certificate of honor for service, or for whatever, service above and beyond, whatever, because it's all voluntary. And does it matter? No. Will I print it out? No. It's the thought that counts, right? It was in this time when we are all feeling so exhausted and stressed out, and you guys are just sort of trying to manage. And I really hope, one of the good things that could come out of this is that you guys download these videos. I mean, they'll be up on YouTube. I don't have any reason to take them down. But to really keep them with you, because as life gets back to normal and you go into your other classes around teaching, questions about child development are going to come up for you, or you're going to take Intro to Psych and some questions might come up for you. The bonus is that you don't necessarily have to keep your book, although I highly recommend you keep it if you can financially. Because there's so many good charts and things in there to go back to. But there's also these lectures that you can go back to, and you can kind of fast forward through them to the right slide, and you can hear the information again, because in this time of high stress, I know it's hard to fully integrate what we've been talking about, and I feel like the discussion questions that you've been answering have really shown me that you're working through it and you're thinking about it in very practical ways. But I know you're overwhelmed with all your other schoolwork and everything you're trying to do to get through this year in a very different way. And so I don't know what you're going to take with you into next year, but you can have these lectures to take with you going forward. So you can pull them out whenever you need them, and they're easy to store on your computer someplace, throw them in a file, and if you ever need them, you can go back to them. So this is what we mean by self-esteem. Backtracking. This is what we mean by self-esteem. It's this idea that what you do is of value, and who you are is of value. It's the reason why at 7 o'clock at night people are outside clapping, because sometimes, even as adults, when you kind of sink into it, into the stress of something, you can have crises. You can feel like, is what I'm doing even worthwhile at this point? You will feel that way as a teacher. Oh my goodness. There will be times where you will question whether or not you're doing anyone any good whatsoever. It's a very stressful job. And so there are these little things that people do on the outside to make you feel of value. And so we're doing that right now with healthcare workers, because when you're working with people and they die, you feel like a failure. And so when you're in a pandemic like this and there's lots of death, you feel very much like a failure. And so you lose your internal pride resources pretty quickly, and that's why all of this recognition from the outside is helping to bolster them up, because they're running out of their own resources, and those are grown-ups under extreme circumstances. Children don't have nearly the amount of self-esteem points built up on the inside, and so in the beginning they require more from the outside to make them feel of value and feel of worth, and then slowly they internalize all that positive stuff and they hold it in reserve, and slowly they begin to be able to feel pride in themselves, and that's where guilt comes from, but we'll talk about that. So the sense of self and who you are inevitably comes to motivate behavior. It is this idea of, I am a person who is funny, I am a person who helps other people. It motivates your behavior, and it organizes. I'm going to do that first one, helps children organize and understand things that happen to them. Yes, that is true. As you get deeper into psychology, you can also understand that we tend to internalize, kids especially, like if something bad happens to them, they think that it happened to them because they're a bad person, right? So you know the cliche that kids often blame their parents' divorce on themselves. Like, if I behaved better, if I was a better person, my parents wouldn't have gotten divorced. So in the beginning, they tend to overinflate through their egocentrism the amount of influence they have on what happens around them and what happens to them. So you have to be careful around that first one. It helps them to envision their future selves, for sure, and to make choices and reach goals. which is what you guys are doing. I want to be a teacher. That's part of your self-concept. And it helps to motivate you to keep moving through, and it helps to set your goals and to sit yourself down and push through this and reach those goals instead of giving up. All right, so I've already said this. Things that influence self-perception. Parents who applaud children's abilities and take inabilities in stride are likely to have children with high self-esteem. Now, let us talk about this, though. That does not mean that you should make your kid believe that they are good at everything. Because the subtle message that you give a kid when you have to give them a participation medal for absolutely everything is that it's not okay for them to fail, right? The real trick about becoming a high-functioning, healthy adult is the ability to maintain your self-esteem even in the face of failure, mistakes, or finding something that you're not good at, right? So parents who punish children for things they do not or cannot do without also praising them for things they've done well are apt to have children with low self-esteem. So one of the things that used to drive me crazy is when a parent, I knew a parent once that I worked with whose child struggled in school. And when the child actually got an A, instead of saying, I knew you could do it, the parent was like, oh my God, he got an A. Can you believe it? Like there was this disbelief in the parent's voice. And so the child never could feel good about the A because the A was seen as such an anomaly by the parent. It couldn't be just a nice job, I knew you could do that could build up the child's sense of this A is something that I can do again. Instead, it was utter shock and surprise, right? So these are the subtle things that parents do that can poke holes in a kid's sense of self-esteem. Or parents who yell and scream at their athletes make them feel like nothing is ever good enough. Like, these are the things we want to avoid in terms of developing self-concept with kids. So don't praise them and pretend they did well when they didn't, but what you can do is acknowledge the difficulty and then hold out hope for getting better. Or you can say something simple as, you know what, not everybody is good at everything. There are things you do well that other kids don't, and there are things that other kids do well that are not your strengths. And that's being human, and that's okay. That's the message, right? That's the message that we're trying to send when it comes to this idea of self-esteem. Okay, we have peers, external things. Peers, acceptance and expectations. As we know, the older you get, the more the acceptance of your peers has on your self-esteem. I'm sure you've experienced that very personally and can think of times and places where maybe you did things that didn't feel quite true to yourself in order to fit in. And we have to go through those moments of dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance, where we feel like, okay, this isn't the person I am, but I'm going to behave in a certain way because I want to fit in because of my whole need for external input into my self-esteem. And then at some point, what we really want is for to be able to be strong enough in ourselves to say, no, this isn't the kind of behavior, and feel good about yourself and not need so much external influence, right? And so what you want are kids to gather together with other kids that tend to have the same interests and things, right? So joining a club that's really into video games or whatever, sports if that's their thing, and then obviously we have to be super careful with social media. Man, oh man, it's a little bit crazy. Social media. We could do an entire class on just social media and its influence. And kids younger and younger, anywhere from 10 to 12, are starting to be influenced by their interactions on social media. Academic performance, and so school environment, so all of that. How well you're doing in school. You spend a lot of time at school. You want to be able to do things that you feel good about. I feel like we've talked about that over and over and over again. The need to focus on strengths. and then may engage in self-handicapping. So to protect one's own self-worth, that's when, okay, so I told you a little bit about this, and I'll tell you again, and it might even come up again. But this idea of internal and external responsibility, locus of control is the technical term. Where is the center of who has control over what? And in order to save ourselves, we tend to externalize it, right? Well, I didn't study. So self-handicapping would be, I'm so worried about failing this test, I'm not going to study for it, so that if I fail, I can say, hey, I didn't study for it, and that's why I didn't pass it, as opposed to putting all your effort into something and then still failing. Okay? That is one of the things that we can be very self-defeating about. All right, developmental trend. Children construct increasingly abstract, integrated, and multifaceted understandings of who they are over time. Doesn't that kind of just make common sense? Now that we understand cognitive development and emotional development, everything about human beings goes from very simple, me, not me, to very complex, right? I am X in terms of my politics. I am vegan. I am not vegan. I am pro this. I am anti that. We become much more abstract and multifaceted in who we are, and it all starts from that initial me, not me, good me, bad me, and then it gets progressively more complex over time. With a lot of that complexity starting in elementary school, but not really blowing up until adulthood. A lot of adolescence, early kindergarten. Most youngsters adopt criteria that others use to evaluate their behavior and characteristics, so that's going to have the influence of culture, right? That's where culture comes into play. That's where peers come into play, school comes into play. You know, this idea, I think I may have told you once or twice about this teacher that I worked with who created a culture in her classroom that was, you will absolutely respect anybody in this classroom, right? Anybody who was going to tease somebody or in any other way had to go. And the criteria that was set up in that classroom for how to feel good about yourself was that you tried your best. And so then trying my best becomes my internalized criteria for whether or not I did a good enough job. Did I do my best effort, right? As opposed to did I get it right? Did I do my best effort? And then you become increasingly committed to particular standards. So you tend to internalize, and the reason you become increasingly committed to particular standards, which we will expand on when we talk about moral development, is because your superego, your center of morality, becomes very fixed over time. There are things that you will adopt as being all right and all wrong, with gray areas then in between as you get older. Feelings of self-worth depend more on their peers' behavior and opinions rather than their parents. That makes sense when you think about it again. Children increasingly behave in ways that mirror their self-perceptions. And so if you keep calling a kid a bad kid, this is why I don't like conduct disorders. This is why I don't like those kinds of diagnoses. And the reason why I don't like, just in general, putting labels on kids is because they tend to behave in ways that mirror it. So their self-worth is tied up in their diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. And then they're like, well, how does a kid with attention deficit disorder behave? And then they behave that way. So we have to make sure that we're leaving plenty of space for kids to rise to the level of our expectations of them rather than limit them with labels that creates their sense of self-worth. Okay, we've already been through this, I feel like, in the other chapters, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Infancy, self is distinct. Lovable, the reason you feel lovable as a being is because people take care of you. So that's trust versus mistrust, right? We go all the way back to Erikson for that. And the dependency stuff around Freud is that you get your sense of good self by the fact that you are taken care of, that you are valued as an infant. Then you get into the concrete stuff. This is preschool and kindergarten time, personal history. Language reflects the self. I, me, mine. So really, toddlers start to do I, me, mine. And then in preschool, you start to say, I am a girl, I'm a boy, this is my mom, this is my dad, and these are the things that define you. Middle childhood, this is where I am tall, I am short, I am a good person, I have a lot of friends. This is really sort of the elementary years. But the second one, more able to compare themselves to others, underline, is where you can start to get into trouble because you just assume that other people are better than you. Especially when you're, I don't know, struggling or have some self-esteem issues that you're bringing into middle childhood. It is, however, see that aware of strengths and weaknesses? That is definitely where we have this sense that that we can survive not being great at something. Like we can lose a game and survive. That's why I love competitive sports or competitive anything. I don't care, competitive chess. Anything that you can lose and still maintain your self-awareness and your good positive self-esteem. Early adolescence, the imaginary audience is this sense that everybody is looking at you and judging you. This is what's under social anxiety. That, the way you dress matters to other people. And what sometimes early adolescents don't understand is that most of other people's criticisms of them come out of their own feeling of their own audience, right? Everybody is really so much more focused on what's wrong with them. And then when they project that onto others, they start to get real catty about it. And this happens in middle school, pretty hardcore. Personal fables, being unique and invincible. This is why adolescents have a hard time paying attention to the quarantine right now, because they feel pretty invincible to it. And many college students, by the way, are still in this phase of feeling like, well, I don't have anything to worry about. Until you see somebody very like you being impacted by something, you can feel kind of invincible. It's an adolescent sense of immortality. In early adolescence, like I said, you start comparing yourself, especially girls. Their self-esteem tends to drop. This is where you get a high level of influence with the media. And here is why this happens. This is not in your book. This is a psychodynamic, again, psychodynamic simulation. As you separate emotionally from your parents, the safety net that they have provided you with starts to go away. And that can be very, very lonely. And so you turn outward to grab onto something, which is often a peer group, a celebrity identification, someone to identify with outside the family to make you feel like you are not alone. Unfortunately, the message for boys is that there's a broader swath of ways to be that are acceptable, and for girls there's a narrower swath of what's cool and what's okay and what's acceptable. And so you have girls showing lower self-esteem as they do this in the past. And then late adolescence, you start becoming an adult. Multiple and contradictory self-perceptions. You can be one way one day. You can handle ambivalence a little bit more. And then intentional efforts towards identity development. So we have identity diffusion, which again, I mentioned in the last chapter when I talked about Erikson and his search for identity, and I mentioned the word foreclosure and identity diffusion and how it can sometimes be cultural. So here it is in its detail in this chapter, which tells us that, so identity diffusion is, some of you may be going through it right now. Some of you are like, I always wanted to be a teacher, and you've gone through your first year of college, and you're like, maybe I don't really want to be a teacher, and you don't really know what you want to do, you don't really know, you've been trying on some identities, you thought you knew, but now you don't. You are in moratorium, okay? If you don't make it through moratorium, your identity can be very diffused. If you foreclose, it means you've never gone through moratorium, and you're just focusing on kind of yourself. I'm going to try and pause this, or I may have to do it twice. Okay, part 2 of the self. Sorry, the last one got interrupted by a phone call, and I have neither the time nor the energy to try and clip these together. So, part 2. we were just talking about, let's go back, rewind. Identity diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium. Identity achievement is when you settle into your identity as an adult. Now, that is not a one-shot deal. Oftentimes in midlife, we have to redefine, and we can go through another moratorium of such, changing careers, divorce, remarriage. All of these things will send you backwards and forwards in terms of your self and identity. And some people change drastically, even later in their life. So it is not a permanent achievement, but it is an achievement in its own right. All right. Phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory. Such a big name for something so simple. What they're trying to say is we are a perceptual machine. That's what our brains do, right? We perceive things. We talked about this when we talked about Piaget and Vygotsky. And so just in the way that we interpret our external environment cognitively, we interpret things with regard to how we process how events and relationships impact our sense of self. So there are things in our environment, and we often look at what creates resiliency. Certainly right now we're looking at what creates resiliency, right? So we know that somebody who has an internal locus of control tends to be more resilient because they don't end up feeling helpless in times like this. They feel like there are things that you can do to influence the outcome. And so even though kids encounter risk factors that have negative impact on self and self-esteem and things of that nature, they also have protective factors. And how they have that will help to determine sort of their level of self-esteem. And then as they exercise coping skills, what are coping skills? I've been thinking a lot about that question actually over the last several weeks as we've been dealing with this, and people are like, oh, coping skills, make sure you exercise and things like that. And I've been thinking, well, what do people really understand about what a coping skill is? And a coping skill is really a series of defenses that are developmentally appropriate and age appropriate that help us manage stress and threats to our sense of self and safety. And it allows us to be flexible. See, they build and rebuild their personal identity. Being able to do that, to build and rebuild your personal identity based on experience and response to various things is really about having some flexibility in the way that you approach the world. And so at times like this, where you feel so out of control, the people who are handling it the best are the ones who can find a new perspective, find some new ways of coping, discover the unhealthy coping mechanisms that they tend to have. Way too many people are relying on alcohol right now as a form of escapism. That is not going to work, and this is going to be a long-term deal. And so we have to help kids find healthier ways of managing stress and frustration and, potential lockdowns and loss and grieving the things they don't have, like graduation and things of that nature. Those are all coping skills. And those are some things that we have to decide if the ones we've used before continue to be effective or if we have to adjust. Sorry. If you hear some background noise, it's because one of my cats has decided that now is the time to get all up in my iPad. So there may be purring or meowing. We're just going to ignore it and press forward because this seems to be the way it's working best in terms of video, in terms of taping things. All right, so gender issues. Okay, so infants distinguish male and female faces. By the age 2.5, most children know that they are a boy or a girl as designated by society, right? In early childhood, children develop gender schemas. What is a boy? What is a girl? What are they like? You can start to see some frustration about being one gender or the other. That's normal. That doesn't necessarily mean they're trans. We talked about that before. Adolescents settle on a gender identity. identifying themselves as being male or female and what that means to them on the spectrum of things. And then gender nonconforming, which we've already talked about. Ethnicity, development of your ethnic identity. So this is really important and interesting, especially for multicultural families, multi-ethnic families, where one of your parents may not appear to be physically the same ethnicity as you are. It's super interesting to watch sort of all of that get figured out. So it begins early. It's affected by parental beliefs and behaviors. How much does your family adhere to more sort of mainstream ethnic stereotypes and norms, I guess? We hope that it results in pride and loyalty to a group. Otherwise, we deal with a lot of self-hatred, which is a huge problem, by the way. It's from a social perspective. Multi-ethnic children are interested in exploring different heritage, and discrimination and bias in the environment can lead to negative self-perceptions, obviously. They start to experience, especially kids who are like multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, where they don't define themselves with just one culture, but they're going to be judged and discriminated against based on their sort of most obvious culture. We're seeing that right now, unfortunately, with a lot of increase in hate crime toward people of Asian descent, even if they're like third generation Americans, right? It's kind of crazy. Culture. Okay, cultures differ in their views of the self. We are an individualistic society. That is why we struggle so hard with agreeing with each other. America is definitely an individualistic culture. We encourage individuation, individual desires, the right to pursuit of happiness, pride in your own achievements, competition. A collectivist society tends to emphasize the group, and that what you do and who you are reflects either well or badly on the group. And so there's pride in group achievements with less focus on individuality. And you will see that because we are so multicultural in the United States, you'll see a little bit of both of that. And that can often be in conflict. Enhancing a sense of self. How do you do it? Okay, communicate interest in the children's lives and their well-being. Promote their successes. Focus on them. Pay attention to them. Focus on personal improvement rather than on comparing them to others. Progress for them is what's important. How it's like time trials versus like, can they go faster than they did the last time? That's an achievement versus being the fastest one in the class, that kind of thing. Be honest about shortcomings, but provide guidance, support, and encouragement. I would add to that they can make improvements. Provide opportunities to explore different things so they can discover who they are. Consider unique needs of girls and boys, but really both. Communicate respect for ethnic and cultural backgrounds without making assumptions about those cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Gratitude and hope. Yeah. Offer chances to develop healthy self-perceptions. That's just offering opportunities for successes and for feeling good about yourself, right? Okay. Social cognition. This is the other part of today. Understanding others' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, theories of mind, perspective taking. So social cognition is really all about empathy. Yeah. Infancy, become aware of intentionality. Others have intentions and act toward goals. That's really the end of infancy, to be honest. Yeah, it's like way at the end, as far as I'm concerned. That's a bit much. Now, they do, for sure, at a very young age, start to engage in social referencing because they will watch other people's reactions. They'll do something, and if their adult laughs, they'll do it again. Okay, that's social referencing. Early childhood is where you really see this come into play, where they're aware of others' mental states. We've talked about this before. From a psychodynamic perspective, it's a sense of separateness, like knowing that if I'm happy, you might not be happy. That's a recognition of another person's mental state. You can try. It's interesting because when kids are really young, like kindergarten-ish, and you say, well, how do you think you would feel if they did that to you? That's a hard question for kids who are just sort of getting this idea of social cognition. And it's sort of a miraculous thing to see when it happens. Maybe it's kindergarten, first grade, 5, 6 years old, where you can say that and they would go, oh, I'd be mad. And that's sort of the dawning awareness of social cognition, right? Okay, middle childhood, recognition that people interpret events, that they might see something differently than somebody else and that somebody else might see things differently than they do. Understanding that people can mask true feelings and thoughts, that somebody might say they're okay, but they're really not. That happens in the elementary school years, as we get closer to adolescence. Okay, part 3, because we keep having these little video errors, but we're going to get through it. All right, early adolescence, development of social cognition, early adolescence. Appreciation that people can have mixed feelings and motives. Sometimes this is another reason why, when you think about the interaction between this and what we were talking about a little bit earlier with regard to like the imagined audience, you're so trying to get a sense of and an understanding at 10, 11, 12 that people have all of these mixed feelings and motives that you start to read into them because you can't be certain of anything for a while, right? Does that make sense? It's like, what does that mean? Well, what does that really mean? Well, they said this on social media. What does that really mean? That dawning recognition that there can be so many different meanings to the things people do and say can make you feel really uncomfortable because you don't know what anything means for a long time. And so it's about practice. I had a patient recently telling me about all the different like social media languages and stuff. And you have to learn all of that, right? Late adolescence, teens are seen as budding psychologists, deciphering and explaining the motives and actions of others. That's exactly the stuff I'm talking about. I'm not even sure that's late adolescence. I think it starts pretty darn early, and then it continues in, and you might either get better at it or, get a little more realistic, I would hope, about it and objective. Selman's theory of social perspective taking. So this is about empathy and being able to take somebody else's perspective and see another point of view. Level 0, egocentric. This is really infancy to kindergarten. Inability to look at a situation from anyone's perspective but your own. I guess it starts in preschool, age 3, maybe 4. Subjective perspective taking, simplistic realization that other people have different thoughts and feelings, but you're not very good at reading them. Level 2, second person reciprocal perspective, recognition that people occasionally have mixed feelings. You can see how this flows with development, right? So this is like middle childhood. It's kind of saying the same thing to me, just in different language. Level 3, third person mutual perspective, ability to take an outsider's perspective and see the advantages of cooperation and trust. So we can look to the political world to see how well we're doing with that right now. And there are some times where people never develop to this stage, right? Even adults. Level 4, societal symbolic perspective, recognition that people are affected by many factors in their environments and understanding that people are not always aware of why they act the way they do. So this is almost like a metacognition kind of thing, like understanding. And not everybody reaches this level. That's just what's true, of being able to understand that people act from unconscious motives. And appreciating that is something that takes education, and exposure. Okay, Selman's social theory seems to underestimate young children's capabilities. I don't know if I agree with that. I think sometimes we want kids to be more advanced than they really are, comfortably. Selman mostly talked about biological maturation as opposed to, kind of the work on social stuff. But his later work suggests that personal experience plays a larger role. And adults can foster development by encouraging perspective-taking skills. So if you're not exposed to it, it's one of the reasons why you may not reach all the levels, is because if that's not how your family works or your culture works, then you may not be exposed to that as a concept. That's all learning that has to take place. Bias and prejudice. So I love this one. So preschoolers can categorize people into groups. Okay, Yes, they can. They will tend to say, why am I vanilla and you're chocolate? They're looking at differences. But what they're doing at this age is they're trying to understand themselves. And so any potential negativity is not about negativity toward the other person. It's a fear that what they are isn't right. And so they have a lot of questions about what's better or worse, not because they inherently think that somebody who's different from them is worse. It's because they're terrified that what they have is wrong, right? So that's why they ask questions. And so the development of prejudice and bias comes from the way we respond to things. And that's why I love books that really look at diversity and appreciate that differences are good and differences are important. So the only reason they favor their own group is because they don't want to be wrong. And they're afraid that their different is wrong. And so in order to protect themselves from their different being wrong, they make the other person's different wrong. I hope that makes sense. And then they get encouragement from the grown-ups in their group. And that's how stereotypes develop. Grade schoolers are way more inclusive than grown-ups are. Adolescents show increase in prejudice. Why? Here's the thing. Think about it. Think about this. So you go into preschool, you go into kindergarten, and you're trying to figure out if you're okay. And so you ask a lot of questions about other people and differences. And let's say you get a really good sense of, like it's okay to be whatever. It's good to be a boy. It's good to be a girl. It's good to be red, blue, black, yellow. It's all good. Whatever color you are is good. Everybody celebrates their differences. You go into your latency period and you think life is good and you get along with everybody and you're just focused on learning stuff and getting good at whatever it is you're good at. And then adolescence hits and you separate from your parents. You feel very alone. You look for a subculture to identify with that's not your parental subgroup, but is something that makes you feel like you're part of a collective, and then you go through all that insecurity again that you went through when you were 4 or 5, about whether or not your developing identity is an okay one, a good one, a popular one, a not popular one, and so you start judging other people in defense of that. Make sense? Right? All right. Certain disabilities can affect the understanding of others. So this really, autism spectrum disorders, Fragile X, social anxiety, limited theories of mind, cognitive disabilities will also make it difficult for you to interpret some of the more subtle nonverbal social cues that allow us to do things like take perspective, have theory of mind, those kinds of things, okay? And that's just a biological thing. So what can we do to foster social cognition? You know what? Talk about psychological phenomena, other people's perspectives. That's why you do that thing. How do you think you would feel if they did that to you? How do you think somebody feels when you say that to them? All of those times where you stop and you talk about these things with the kids in your classroom at any age in elementary school, you are teaching them to take perspective. And you are teaching them social cognition. Asking them to take perspective of somebody in a story that they read. How was that character thinking and feeling? What might they do next? All of those kinds of things allow you to project perspective and to wonder about perspective given the verbal and nonverbal cues you've been given. You may have to do it more intentionally with kids who have some cognitive delays that make it harder for them. And then promote an inclusive setting to break down stereotypes and prejudice. Cooperative group work. All right. So take-home messages. Sense of self includes your sense of who you are as defined and your self-confident concept, which means your value and your worth, right? So this is who I am and is who I am, good or bad. Understanding that other people have thoughts and motives that are complex, and making sure that you don't defend your own insecurities about the rightness or the wrongness of who you are by making other people wrong so you can somehow feel okay, right? That's where bullying, stereotyping, prejudice, all that comes from that inherent insecurity in the value and worth of your own self as you define it. And so those kids need help. Okay, that was a short one because, but we got through it in 3 parts. Okay, fantastic.